So this is our last panel of the evening on early stage startup M&A. We have such an amazing panel here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Maybe if we go down the list, just say who you are, what you do, and what is on your wish list for Santa Claus this year. Just to
My name's Amin Zufanoon. I do corp dev, which is M&A at Google. I've been there about, I guess I'm in my 8th year. I was an engineer, a lawyer before that, and wish list from Santa Claus is less work.
My name is Elad Gil, and I'm here to represent, I believe, the entrepreneurial side of things. So I sold my company to Twitter about a year ago, and I've also been advising and investing in a number of startups, and so I've probably helped 5 or 6 of them out in terms of M&A over the last year, just in terms of negotiating with potential acquirers. And then for Christmas, I'm actually Jewish, so I deserve 8 gifts, and that'll probably take too long to go through, so I'll just pass it on.
I don't know if I can follow that. Taylor Merida from Yahoo Corp Dev. In terms of things I would want for Christmas.
or from Hanukkah Charlie.
Yeah, no,
Hanukkah Charlie.
it's fine. So I guess first of all, I've been at Yahoo about 18 months and worked across our business in sort of social, the ad side, as well as the communications group as well. In terms of what I would want for Christmas, we were actually just talking about the fact that unfortunately this past year we're sort of devoid of personal lives, and so it's hard to even think about what I would actually want. So I'll probably stick with the fact that my daughter just lost her first front tooth, and so the other one seems to be on the way, so we'll sort of do that stereotypical, all you want for Christmas is your 2 front teeth. So should be a good Christmas in our household.
I'm Mike Brown. I manage corporate development at Facebook. I've been at Facebook for about 2 years, and my girlfriend and I both really want puppies, but we can't really look after them because of our schedule. So if we could have dogs at the office, I think we would want puppies for Hanukkah/Christmas.
Puppies, great. So if you're trying to pitch your startup to Mike, just show up with a puppy and drop it off. So just real quick on the format, we've got about 40 minutes for the panel, and then we'll have about half hour for audience Q&A. I want to get through a couple core topics, and then we'll open it up. So be thinking of what you want to ask these guys. Let's start with you. Google is a deal machine. I don't know how many deals have you done this year, but start us off with a little overview of the process. What happens when you're acquiring a startup? What teams are involved? How long does it take? Give us just kind of an overview of the process from the Google perspective.
Sure. So the process is not standard by any means. I would say that it depends on the particular startup, why we're looking at it, and who's looking at it within Google. So average time we quote is a couple months or a month. It could be shorter. Actually, the bigger deals tend to go much quicker. The smaller deals tend to take longer, and we could talk about why that is generally. And the process is generally we get to know the team, we get to know the technology, we get to know whatever we can before we kind of go to our executives and seek approval for the deal and get consensus from the various teams. And then what happens is you as a startup would see a much bigger than I think most people expect team of professionals that get involved, which includes my team, which leads a integration team, a finance team, a legal team, HR for getting people offers and getting them Google badges and to conduct the diligence and get the deal through. So it's, I think, a typical process for the most part.
Maybe talk about the diligence and information. A lot of startups have concerns when they start to talk to a large company, as Naval was talking about, of sharing information, worried about Google becoming a competitor. Maybe, what information is disclosed and when in the process?
Absolutely. No, that's a good question. And as paranoid as startups are and entrepreneurs are with respect to their confidential information, and they should be, we as a big company who pride ourselves on doing things right and good and all that and not evil are very paranoid. I think I could speak for most of the companies up here about actually being tainted with third-party confidential information. So we're very careful to only receive just enough to make decisions to get to the next step. So it's a very kind of pyramid process. As you get deeper, you sign a term sheet, you're close to a merger agreement, we would exchange deeper kind of confidential information. So we don't want to know your secret sauce before we get to that stage, actually.
Until you've made an offer, or at least a range of what the consideration would be? Is that
Typically even post that. We get a good idea of things. We try to agree on what the deal terms would look like. Once we sign a term sheet and go down the process of diligence, and we get closer to a definitive merger agreement, you would see us do things like code reviews and such.
good? Taylor or Mike, anything more on the process? Does it follow a similar format at Yahoo and Facebook? Anything unique to your companies?
Some U.S. president once said, plans are meaningless or useless. Planning is everything. And so for us, the people who build the products are probably more important than the products themselves. And so our diligence is really going to focus on the small number of people who brought that product to life to make sure that we're excited about them, that they have good technical chops and a lot of vision. And so I would kind of double underline the evaluation of a small group of people in your company as being the most important step in the process. And then after that, it's very smooth.
Yeah, I think for us it's similar. I think the nuance is, I think we're very focused on sort of cultural fit and alignment of vision. I mean, I think Yahoo, you know, over the last 15 years or whatever, has developed its own, you know, sort of culture and sense of, you know, what it's trying to do. And, you know, at times we've, you know, muddled our external articulation of that. But I think internally, you know, it matters that people want to be there, and that they think that they can do more together with us than sort of just going off and seeing it as an exit and a check. So I think very early on, we're trying to get a feel for, you know, do we have a shared vision? And I think in regards to the question of sort of the secret sauce, you know, my sort of working assumption is that, you know, in theory, our engineers could go do anything, given them enough time. And so I'm not talking to any company that, you know, that we don't already assume that there's a speed to market thing, there's something unique there. And so it's almost like you can just take that off the table and not worry about it. I think the true secret sauce stuff, you know, that comes out in the code review and that would particularly, you know, like you were saying, can taint you, that comes extraordinarily late in the process. And sometimes, you know, we even use third parties for, you know, code scans and things like that, so that we truly aren't tainted.
Elad, you're representing the entrepreneur in the room because your company was acquired, but does Twitter have a corp dev team? Has Twitter made many acquisitions? What is Twitter ramping up? Any commentary on that?
Yeah, Twitter's made a number of acquisitions. There's a corp dev team, so Jessica Varelli works on it. It's under Kevin Thaw, who runs corp dev and BD. And there have been a number of acquisitions. I think very early on in Twitter's history, they bought Surmise, which was a search engine. I think that was when Twitter was about 15 people. And so it was a small company that they bought, but still was a pretty large proportion of the overall company and culture. We were the first acquisition since then, I believe, and then they've made a number of other ones, including Tweety, DabbleD, and a few others. So.
Interesting. Good. So we put on the Eventbrite registration, we put it out there, you know, for folks to see what questions they wanted to see addressed, and almost universally, it was how do I get on your radar? How do I start talking to corporate development folks? Mike, maybe I'll start with you on this one. Facebook's made a number of smaller acquisitions, mostly talent. I think I read somewhere it was about 10 this year so far, but it seems like you're gearing up to do more and maybe larger ones. How do startups get on your radar and get into a discussion, typically?
Facebook's an engineering company. Engineers rule. And so the best way to get on our radar is through the engineering side of the organization. You can come to me and say, hey, Mike, you know, we're thinking about our strategic options or whatever parlay people use. And I'll certainly do my best to be helpful. I'll make the right introductions to the right people inside the company. But ultimately, if you can get a product or engineering leader at Facebook excited about what you're doing, especially if they've known you or you've known them from prior work experiences, that's really the best way to create momentum, because then my job actually gets a lot easier and the process goes smoother. Because when I sit in front of our CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, and he looks at me and says, Mike, you don't know how to code your way out of a box, which is true, I can say, yeah, but Brett Taylor really thinks these guys are good, or Gokul Rajaram really says these people are terrific. And when we have that kind of support to get a project done, meaning an acquisition consummated, it really is the most compelling thing for Facebook, and gets us excited to move fast and to make it happen.
Does that hold true for Google and Yahoo? Is it better to go in through a business unit or a product unit than go into corp dev? How often is it a push to corp dev versus a pull from?
I think we frankly see both. I mean, we do a lot of sort of external outreach in terms of just being out there, doing events, talking to different people, checking in with all of the VC relationships we have, and just sort of seeing what they're talking about and what they've invested in. And so, introductions in through people we know is always a good thing. It's part of the theory of social networks and whatnot. But I think, certainly coming through product is also great. Ultimately, I totally agree with Mike that we're trying to partner with our business leaders and product leaders to build the business. And so, ultimately, in many ways, we're the people who sort of help get it done. But oftentimes in the early stages, we act more as a concierge to sort of make a connection, because you may or may not be at a point where you're actually even looking to exit, and you're just trying to sort of establish that relationship. And so I think that's another thing that we end up doing quite a bit of, is where, at a big company like Yahoo or Google, I think Facebook's probably well on its way to getting that way too, is people sort of say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about XYZ, but I just don't know who to go to. And I think, that's with us being sort of more externally focused and out there and talking to people, you can, more than likely, someone that we know, and you can just get connected into us, and then, we can get you in touch with a product person if there's a product partnership you're looking to do in the short run. And then if in the long run we're aware of you, that's a good thing too.
Anything different at Google?
I think it's pretty much what my colleagues here said. I would just add that to answer your question, I'd also go back to why we look to acquire, and maybe that's part of the question that folks are asking. And if it's for engineering prowess, obviously having an engineering team within the company that supports that and feels there's a need for a team with that kind of expertise is something that's more determinative, as Mike mentioned, through the engineering teams or the product teams than it is through corp dev. But we acquire for other reasons as well. We do acquire for a product or technology that we feel gives us time to market advantage or helps us achieve some goal that we're trying to achieve faster or better. Other times we acquire for, what I would call big bets. Android's a good example of that. And then we also acquire things that have some kind of a leadership position, market leadership, technology leadership, and we could think of all the big deals that Google has done as examples of those.
Cool. Elad, how did the initial discussions start off with Mixer Labs?
I guess I'd go back to an old saying, which is companies don't get sold, they get bought. And I think our case was an example of that, where we basically had a hosted geolocation service, and we were going through a large list of partners that we were actually trying to get on board as a partner who would actually pay us for the service, in terms of, we'd bill them monthly kind of thing. And after the third or fourth conversation, I got an email from Ev, who at the time was the CEO of Twitter, saying, hey, we don't think it makes sense to have you do this as a partner, but we'd love to talk about having you come in-house to actually work with us. And that's sort of what kicked off the discussions.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's stick with you for a minute. Another common theme among folks' questions was timing and when to start talking. Let me talk with you. I think it's always interesting for startups that have proven the business model. I call it the fork in the road. Either you go raise a bunch more money, or you start to talk to acquirers. You sold fairly early. Maybe talk about why you sold when you did, and lessons learned along the way, and any signals to pay attention to as the founder.
Sure. I guess ultimately there were 4 considerations that we had. I don't really have 4. I'm just going to make them up as I talk. So it sounds as if I really thought this through or something. So the first one was basically the changing dynamics in the marketplace. And so geolocation was heating up as a market at the same time. We thought at the time that the direction that we were heading in was one that some very large companies may enter. So we thought Google, as an example, may enter it as a supplement to what they were doing in local. Twitter at the time was thinking about providing geolocation as sort of a broad-based thing for its ecosystem. And so we saw these large players with very large ecosystems considering the space. I didn't mean they were going to move in that direction, but it was one consideration. Second, we thought it was a great place where our technology could actually have enormous impact and where our team could have enormous impact, because ultimately, again, there's this massive developer community that we had the potential to access. Third, we thought that there was upside because Twitter was a company that we felt could have a lot of multiples in terms of the valuation that it was at the time. And I think that's actually proven true right now with some of the rumors that are going around in the marketplace about them. And I said 4, so I have to come up with a 4th now. I really like Ev. So there you have it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's good. And how about turning this same question of timing and when to start thinking about it over to the corp dev guys? Throw it out there. When should a startup start approaching you guys if you're not approaching them? When is a good time to build that relationship?
Well, I was on a panel with these guys in the summer, and I said there was no time too early. Feel free to reach out to us at any point. And we did got quite a few people reaching out very, very early. But that said, it's really sort of true. You don't need a big agenda. I think if you think, you should have a general sense of the different parts of our business and how you might fit in. But if you think there's a realistic way that it might fit in, feel free to reach out, and then we get a conversation going. It doesn't need to be, hey, I'm ready to sell and all those kind of things. I think in general, if you have something to show, meaning a product in market that's sort of beginning to get traction, that gives people more to talk about. But other than that, I think it's perfectly fine to have an early dialogue, and it takes time to sort of get to know people across the company. And I think sort of setting that stage so that you know the different people in the industry. Again, if you're sort of the theme of this night is sort of thinking about your exit, and I think there's usually a few places that are going to be a home. And as I said earlier, we focus a lot on fit, and frankly, you should too, because you're going to be working there for a few years afterwards, except in really extreme instances. And so, the more time you have to get to know people without the pressure of trying to get a deal done, it can make you more comfortable and confident when you get to the point of looking at different options. That the one that if it feels right, you can sort of be sure that it's not just emotion of the moment, that it's had time to sort of settle in and stuff. So I think it is good to go ahead and get started to know a bunch of different people, not just the corp dev people in the business.
Mike, anything to add?
No.
No. Good enough. Maybe a quick question for the corp dev guys. How many acquisitions started out as some sort of partnership or strategic joint venture, something else, and led to an acquisition? Is it half? Is it fewer than that?
I would say almost all of the deals that we do tend to be, at least from our standpoint, very broadly viewed. So we're looking at it from what can we do together, and if acquisition makes the most sense, then that's the route we go. So many times I'm in the room with my biz dev counterparts.
Good.
Yeah, I'd say in the nature of the conversation that's absolutely true. Is that again, you sort of have these meetings and you're trying to sort through what could we do together, and then just like Elon talked about, there's sometimes when it heads one way, and sometimes when you sort of hit a point and you say, wait a second, this really only makes sense if we're going to go ahead and do the acquisition. In terms of, I think maybe the specific other side of the question of people who are existing partners and then leading to acquisition. I'm sort of pulling a number out of thin air, but maybe 50%. There's some sort of business relationship already in place.
Cool.
Yeah, I would say companies we're talking to now, and at least one acquisition we've made, we had either some sort of business arrangement. It's one of these things where with little companies, because we're bigger, we feel like if we do a partnership, we're going to make them big and successful, which is good. I mean, that's great that companies become big and successful in working with us. But if it then puts us in a position where we could kind of become held hostage to that company, or we can't control our destiny, or things may not go the way we anticipate in the future, it can become challenging. And so we try to cut that off at the pass and say, listen, probably better for our interests to try to acquire this company now so that we can build value together, rather than have more of an arm's length relationship where in the future, if there's conflict, it's going to be more challenging for both sides. So there are some circumstances where that happens, where it makes more sense to acquire now rather than partner with the company so that they grow, and then you have to think about what to do down the road.
Yeah, good. All right, another topic I want to cover before we open it up is valuation and deal structure. This is a perennial favorite of folks. I think more energy is spent worrying about valuation than just about anything else. I mean, I'll start with you. How do you establish a valuation, especially at a very early stage company, in the absence of comps, maybe early revenue or even pre-revenue? Or let's call it early revenue. How are you establishing a valuation? What are you looking at?
We have a magnetic dartboard in the Corp Dev team.
Dartboarding?
Yeah. No, I mean, for a private company that's small and a small team, maybe unproven technology, no revenue yet, it's difficult. We have one luxury, which is we're a comp maker in the Valley. So we can look back at our previous deals, and we use advisors and lawyers who also give us an idea of the other deals that are happening in the Valley. So we have a pretty good idea of what's happening in the market, also through the VC network, in terms of valuation. But again, for those types of situations where you can't do a DCF and you can't do traditional comp analysis in a public market, it's really a negotiated valuation.
Yeah.
You look at what you've done in the past that had similar size, similar build time, similar size team, who the VCs are, what kind of returns are they going to expect, how much money has gone into the company, and you do your best to come up with something that's a win-win and reflects the market, and then it's negotiated.
Is Naval's metric of 1 to 2 million per engineer sound about right? Is that something you can look at as a baseline comp depending on the heat of the deal?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily actually characterize it that way because I'm not sure we necessarily do deals that are purely just a corp dev deal that is really a hiring exercise.
Got it.
I mean, those kind of things lead to sort of perverse incentives to staff up with engineers too.
Right.
So I think it's sort of those are a little funny. I mean, the other thing too. I mean, to sort of twist the question a little bit, but I mean, we frankly, in terms of trying, I think we fundamentally view an M&A transaction as a collaborative sort of beginning to a relationship that we're going to have. And so, the sort of two deals that we've done this year, the Citizen Sports and the Dapper deal, both of those, the leadership team has come in and taken bigger roles beyond just the business they were running pretty quickly. And frankly, we're looking to sort of get a feel for when that can happen and when that can do it. So in order to sort of put together a deal, sort of my assumption is, yes, companies are bought, not sold, and I definitely understand that. But at the flip side, I can't make anyone sell that doesn't want to sell, and I can't sort of make them take a price, and so I don't even try. I think we focus very much on trying to pay a fair price for a business that we both believe that we can make bigger together. And so one of the sort of rules that we have is we won't put an offer out without sort of seeing the cap table and understand the dynamics of what you're facing. Because frankly, sometimes that helps you a lot because we realize just due to the natures of the venture world that sometimes we maybe need to stretch a little bit more just in order to sort of keep all the stakeholders happy. It's one of those things where within a realm of reason, sometimes you can do those things, and it's in everyone's interest to sort of get the facts on the table and sort of understand what the real dynamics are that's going on in the boardroom when you're having these discussions.
I guess from my perspective, I do think that the multiple per engineer thing is true. For basically when companies are buying teams versus buying either a strategic asset like an AdMob or alternatively something for cash flow like what IAC may be more likely to do. If you had the exact same product and you had twice the number of people and the product wasn't getting very much traction and you sold it, you'd get more for it. So there is that team buy aspect. The second point I'd like to make is around valuation from the perspective of I think valuations can be misleading in two ways. And so I've been helping out some people who've been doing deals, especially on the smaller side in some cases, so say $5 to $10 million acquisitions. And in that case, certain things can actually cause really big movements in the value that the entrepreneur ends up with. And I think there are 4 or 5 of those. The first is the lockup period or the vesting schedule. If you're not going to stick around, say that you have a 3-year vest and you leave after a year, you just left 2/3 of the value on the table. As an entrepreneur, you may have gotten some up front, but fundamentally you need to take that into account. So a $10 million acquisition where you own 40% of the company or 30% because you haven't raised a lot of money could be worth $1 million to you instead of $3 or $4 million, or whatever multiple on top of that. So that's one thing. Second is dividending out cash or not. If you have $1 million that you raised in cash in the bank and somebody's buying you for $5 million and you don't dividend out the cash, you just subsidize the acquisition by $1 million. So you just reduce the deal value by 20%. Third is the upside of the currency. So some companies are going to have multiples in terms of where they are today, especially certain private companies, and some aren't. And so that also impacts the upside that you have. And so I think ultimately just straight valuation is a little bit misleading, and you should really take into account all those different factors when you're considering selling a very early stage company.
Yeah, Mike, anything to add on the valuation?
No, I think Elad's point is really good. I think it's really right. I'll add one additional piece. It's just one thing that goes into our consideration is managing kind of the esprit de corps of the Facebook engineering team. And I think this was mentioned a little bit, but we can't just spread extra frosting all over these new engineers that are coming in, because for folks who have joined us through the front door, it's, I think, pretty frustrating. It's kind of a shitty thing to do, where you look at the guy to your right or the woman to your left and you say, wait a minute, why did this person get a significantly better deal than I did? And we face that and we take that really seriously. So I was in an engineering meeting recently with directors talking about buying a company for about $20 million of Facebook stock. And we got a significant amount of pushback from some of the engineering directors who said, well, wait a minute, do we really, really value these people that much? Because we could take 10 superstar engineers from Google, just kidding, that we really, really admire. And we could provide each of those 10 superstars a $2 million bonus, right? 10 times 2 is 20. And people take those alternatives very seriously in terms of how we're using our company's money. And I think our engineers, they'll say it. Listen, if we hire someone who's kind of a reputed superstar, and someone will say, yeah, okay, I get it that that person maybe got paid better than I did because they're a superstar and I'm just a normal star or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think that doesn't disrupt the spirit of the company that much. But managing an engineering culture and scaling it where you're trying to keep hundreds, or maybe someday Facebook will have thousands of engineers. Certainly these companies do because they're bigger and successful. It's hard to manage those competing interests. I'm the deal guy. I want to do lots of deals because doing deals is fun and buying companies is fun and it's very exciting. But at the same time, we need to manage the engineering culture because ultimately those people have to work together, hopefully for years to come.
Yeah, really interesting. Related to valuation, of course, is generating competition for a deal. So Elad, maybe I'll turn this one over to you. How do you go about, as a startup founder, getting more than one party interested in a deal so you have a little more leverage? I believe you mentioned with Mixer you had a couple parties interested. How do you get some heat on a deal, basically?
I think fundamentally, once you have one offer, then it becomes very natural for other people to get interested. And so that could be mentioning the offer to advisors, and this is before you sign any sort of exclusivity or anything else. So you need to make sure that you are timing it properly. That typically, so if you mention it to advisors or other people who have connections into these guys, and they hear, for example, that Google is looking at a specific company, then they may get interested, and then the company can sometimes end up going through the rounds. Or alternatively, if it's an interesting enough space or it's considered a big strategic asset, then often companies will be proactively going after the company. And so I don't know anything at all behind the details of what's been happening with Foursquare, but I'm assuming that in a lot of cases, companies have been going and approaching them versus them having to go and solicit interest.
Interesting. And Corp Dev guys, I know it's a little bit contrary to your interest to comment on this, but any tips on what startups should or should not do to to get some heat on a deal, do you usually ask startups to sign a no-shop clause? And if so, when does that come into play? Mike, go for it. How do these guys sell their startup for insane valuations is the
Yeah.
question, really.
I mean, listen, you're all very smart, and to tell you anything other than the truth would be stupid. Get multiple offers and get a bidding war going, right? If I were in your shoes, that's what I would try to do. There's not a lot of rocket science to that aspect of it. Of course, you know, we're going to tell you we want to be the only home for you. We think we're the right home. We're going to be your best friend, blah, blah, blah. We do think we have a good company, and we're happy with what we're doing. But you know, let's talk money for a minute, because this is life-changing stuff for many of you. So, get multiple bidders, manage your process, and don't sign a term sheet until you're really sure you want to do the deal. We don't give term sheets unless we want to buy your company. Like, it's not kind of a joke or a second date for us. It's like we really want to buy your company. Mm-hmm. And by the same token, when you sign a term sheet from us, and most companies, I think, usually has a no-shop clause in it. For those of you who don't know what that is, it means that you can't go try to get a better deal or a comparable deal. You've kind of said, I'm hitching my horse to this wagon. So don't do that unless you're really sure. Until then, do it a lot and hustle, because you owe it to yourselves and the people who presumably work for you to get them the best deal that you can.
Maybe blah blah blah, but again, our philosophy is, and frankly, partially this is pragmatism. I mean, the fact of the matter is Google has tens of billions of dollars on their balance sheet. So if we just sort of jerked our head around every time we heard in the market that they were looking at something and started chasing it on price, frankly, if Larry and Sergey want it, they're going to get it. So it sort of is the nature of that. And so I think we've taken a little bit of different approach, and it goes back to sort of that longer dialogue of trying to find the right fit and trying to people that sort of think that that when they come in the business, that truly it's not just about an exit, and it's not just about the fact that they're going to sort of get to keep doing what they're doing inside of us, but that there's something that we have, whether it be the reach of the network, whether it be the sales force, or something that they look at and go, you know what, yes, I can get an exit, but number two, I actually get to sort of build a bigger business inside of Yahoo, and then that's something there. I think we fully realize that, and I think the thing I would agree with everyone on is the forcing function of getting to a decision on a rapid timeline. Having someone else in the boat totally matters, but I think you can't get too hung up on just chasing another offer for the sake of chasing another offer. I would just sort of say, ask yourself whether or not it's fair, and if you think it's fair and it's where you want to end up, you may be completely wasting your time. If you're really in with Amin and you want to end up at Google, going and calling us, trying to get a competing offer when he's already put a fair offer on the table, and if that's where you should, again, know enough about the differences of the companies, the strategies, the people, to understand which one's a good fit for your team and your product. And so I totally understand where Mike's coming from, and again, it is a capitalist country, and you should absolutely go for it, and we're all fine with that. And again, we're going to pay what we're willing to pay, and you're going to sell for what you're willing to sell, and if those two things match, we're going to get something done, and we're fine with that. But I think remember that fundamentally a deal is a beginning and not an end.
Yeah, I think I would add to what's been said already, that a lot of this and a lot of the questions that have been asked tonight, I'll keep going back to why are we doing the deal? Where are we in the process of doing the deal? Because if we're at the point where we're issuing a term sheet, and we're the same way, when we issue a term sheet, it will have a no-shop clause. We feel like we're dedicated at that point, and we hope that you're dedicated as well. We've assessed fit on both sides. So at that point, if you actually take our term sheet and go shop it, that would be upsetting to us, quite frankly. And it depends, again, on the kind of deal. So if it's DoubleClick, which was owned by a private equity firm, that's purely financial incentive, one would argue. for the private equity firm to run an auction process and try to maximize valuation. It's not about team fit and that kind of thing. But if it's a team fit kind of acquisition and you've gone to Facebook or Google 10 times and you've had various dialogues with engineering managers, product managers on what you're going to do, how you're going to fit into the organization, there's this trust that's been building. We get to the point that we're issuing a term sheet, then you turn around in the shop that, I think that's inappropriate. So it depends where you are and what you're seeking to do.
And I would add two things to that. One is, you can optimize for valuation, but again, you don't want to go somewhere that you're going to be miserable, especially if you have a multi-year vest, because again, that just means all that value is going to go away because you'll leave early anyhow. Second, if you do sign a term sheet, one of the things that I would encourage negotiating in is actually a very short diligence period, as short as possible, and that does two things. One is I think it streamlines the process in terms of ensuring that there's less wiggles and waggles around the road as you're negotiating, less sort of last minute things can come up. But second, it also gives you a shorter window so that if things don't work out with that acquirer and you're really set on doing an acquisition, you don't become extremely stale as a company.
How long? When you say short, how short is short? What, give a time frame.
It depends, because you could front load a lot of these things. So if it's a purely team acquisition, you would probably want to see resumes, right, Mike? You'd probably want to see some kind of overview of the skill of the team, the makeup of the team, and you'd probably want to see that before you actually make, as a corporate acquirer, a go, no-go decision. But again, if it's a secret sauce, which is ancillary, if it checks out somewhere down the process, but you anticipate that process taking 30, 60 days, 45 days, what have you. I mean, there's a range, and it depends, again, on the size of the company and the complexity. Now, for a small company, I was just going to add, to ask for a small diligence period, diligence is a two-way street. Mm-hmm. So what we find is the smaller companies that are not VC funded, for example, they tend not to have their books in order. They tend not to have somebody who can run the business and deal with the disruption that this M&A process causes for them. So those deals, that's why I mentioned earlier, tend to take longer, and the diligence period takes longer, not because of us. It's frankly not us, it's you.
That's a good comment.
Yeah, and I think just sort of riffing on that, it's like, again, it's fundamentally a collaborative process, and we have no interest in dragging our feet, because invariably we want to sort of get something done and get on to building the business that we see together. Oftentimes, essentially, we ask for what we think is enough time to sort of get something done. We also automatically have auto-renew clauses in there so that we don't have to stop and renegotiate and things like that. And sometimes people have questions about that, but our philosophy is, again, I'm not aware of us ever having gone through a signed term sheet and not close a deal. I mean, I'm sure at someday it'll happen because you'll find some gnarly bad thing that will make you walk away. But in general, as these guys have said, we don't take it lightly. I mean, if you put a term sheet out there, it's because you're trying to get something done. And then from that point forward, you really truly are partners in terms of getting all the information out there, working through the process, and getting everyone bought off and getting it done. And as Amin said, it's like the biggest gating factor is that startups are going through this for the first time, and oftentimes they've been running their business as they should, and not having everything in a file cabinet ready to go and show us and prove that everything's in order. So it just oftentimes takes longer than they imagine to sort of get it all in order. And so what I often do is, when we have whatever that timeline is that we've set up, we talk about milestones, and I basically say, we will give you, on the day that we sort of present this, we'll give you our super duper diligence list that has all the stuff that we're going to need. If you can get a fully populated data room with that inside of by X date, I will commit to you that I will drive our forces harder than they've ever been driven to hit whatever that date is. And so it's one of those things where it has to be, you have to develop a trust factor to get a deal done, and it's a two-way street. And so then if they miss that deadline, it's not that I'm not going to keep trying to move fast, but just we're all on the same page around sort of what's holding it up, and then we're trying to work together to get it over the finish line.
Let's expand on this a little bit, and talk about where do deals fall apart. What are common pitfalls that cause a deal to derail? I mean, having your books not quite in order it might slow the process, but it's typically not going to stop it. Why do deals fall apart? If you can pick out the top few reasons.
I mean,
Yeah.
in our case, the few that have are because we have some assumption.
This is not about Groupon. This is a broader question. No. Sorry. I'm sorry. Bad question.
Sorry, brain.
Whoops.
It goes back to, key assumptions regarding why we're doing the deal. So if we're doing the deal based on the strength of the technology to do X, Y, and Z, and we go in and actually do diligence and we saw that it's snake oil,
Spaghetti
that
code,
could fall apart. Or I'm sure if you're considering a team that you think is strong at doing X, Y, and Z, and you go through the interviews and you find out that's not the case, it could fall apart. But if you're acquiring a small technology and team company, and that's why you're doing it, whether their balance sheet showed 200K in debt and you in diligence somehow you find out it's 300K, at least for a company like Google, is not going to be dispositive on whether you do the deal.
You guys have anything to add on typical reasons why deals have fallen apart, or?
I mean, as we talked about, I think by the time you get to a term sheet, so much work has been front-loaded that in this day and age, it's extraordinarily rare for something to fall apart that point. I think when things fall apart before that, oftentimes it's, people trying to be too cute or cagey or whatnot. And some point, they're just, you lose that trust. And, you're not selling us a used car, right? I mean, we're trying to put something together, and it is an acquisition, but it's fundamentally a sort of this partnership of the starting of putting something together. And so it's not just, with the deal lead or whatever that you have to build that trust. It's also with the business sponsor, the technology lead, and all that stuff. And I think the things I see, at least, sometimes you can save it, but the things that lead things off course is when people aren't forthcoming. It's a lot better to say, yeah, look, I've got a great team. This guy's great. This guy's doing okay. He's serving a purpose now. I think, he has some upside, but realistically, you sort of call it like it is, and you develop credibility. And again, we've all seen a lot of these things, whether it's technology or people or market risk or whatever. Yes, you should absolutely be positioning yourself in the best light that you would want us to perceive you in, and that's fine, and we're comfortable with that. But you should also make sure that you do that with a full set of facts. Like, the absolute worst thing you could possibly do is try to sort of duck and dive and sort of think that we're not going to find something, because by the time we're done with diligence, we'll have found pretty much everything. And so you better just get it out there early, and and then we'll work through it together and see if we can get something done.
I would throw in two other things. One is I've seen this happen more recently with a large private company that a friend of mine was one of their first acquisitions, and in that case, there's a lot of ambiguity in the term sheet, and I think it was just a lack of savvy on both sides, which led to a lot of heartbreak and sort of issues later on in the process. So that's one thing. The second thing is we're talking about the deal falling apart, but I think another thing to consider is your company falling apart during the process, because it's a huge distraction. As a founder, you're trying to run a business, and at the same time, you're trying to go through this process against some well-armed professionals who've done it a bunch of times before.
Not against, with.
Yes, with hand in hand. I'm just joking about that. But I think there's a lot of things that can be really disruptive, including, as an example, having your employees being interviewed by the company. And that can go a bunch of different ways. One is if the company doesn't want to bring them on board for one reason or another, they may choose out an employee. In our case, that didn't happen, but I've seen that happen. Or alternatively, the people on the team can get really excited. Like, oh my God, I'm going to Facebook, or I'm going to Yahoo or Google or whatever it is. And that can be extremely disruptive because people get extremely distracted. And instead of executing on the business, which is really what you should be doing, people start to wander. Their minds start to wander a lot. And so that means that as you're going through the diligence process, I think you really need to choose the right time at which your team is exposed to the other company. And it's tricky timing, because if it's a team buy, that is the basis in large part for the deal. But at the same time, you don't want your team to get enormously distracted in case the deal falls apart. And so it's a really fine line and a fine thing to balance. And that's, again, why I was sort of advocating quick diligence cycles, if you can pull it off.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys, I think, do some slightly different deals where it's just a pure talent deal. I mean, for us, frankly, we're, every now and then there'll be a pure talent deal, but they're, every few years type of thing. I think oftentimes it's much more likely to be tech and talent. And in those situations, you know, we're comfortable evaluating you more on output versus input, if you will. And so if we look at the fact and that, you know, it's a great piece of technology that's extraordinarily well architected and thoughtful, and it obviously is going to scale. And, oh, by the way, you have a rock star lead CTO, and, you know, we've met the, you know, the engineering manager from Israel, and they're great. And, you know, it's like the whole piece, you kind of know that in our, you know, in the engineering cultures and whatnot, you know, the you know, people follow the great engineers, and so that alone says a lot to us about the team. And oftentimes we're comfortable, you know, with an in the know list on the seller side of, you know, pretty small, 5 or 10 people maybe. So, you know, if you're doing a talent acquisition, the entire company's 5 or 10 people, I can imagine to be in a different scenario. But I think, again, let us know what your concerns and constraints are, and, you know, and we're going to help work through that. And, you know, there may be situations, I'll let Mike speak for himself, but, you know, there may be situations where you truly have to interview everyone. There may be other places where we're comfortable drawing the line at a tighter circle.
One thing I'd also add is to actually rewind the clock from these corp dev discussions. And when you're a small startup and you're excited about doing a commercial deal with Yahoo, say, and somewhere in the back of your mind you're thinking you might want to have an exit with Google or Microsoft, how do you structure your contracts so you don't actually have that be a deal breaker with the other party? So do you sign up to exclusivity arrangements, source code escrows? So be very careful how you structure your contracts. Those contracts could look very exciting from a big partner for a startup, but they could actually impede your ability for an exit.
Yeah, that's good. All right, we're have to watch the clock here. One last question, and then we'll open up to the audience. Let's go down the line, and Elad, if you want to comment on Twitter, feel free. Let's go down the line, though, and have everyone state how many deals they expect to do in 2011 and what types of deals you're looking for. If you have any visibility into that, you know, what are you hunting? And then maybe a bonus question of who else is going to be a very active acquirer in 2011 beyond you guys? Is Apple going to pick it up? Is Amazon, eBay? Mike, start with you. How many deals in 2011 do you think, and what sectors, types, stages? Crystal ball.
You know, maybe 15 acquisitions. They will be a mix of talent acquisitions where we're looking for people to run important parts of our product who have really strong vision. So I'll give you some examples. Maybe it's social commerce. Maybe it's HTML5 stuff that we're interested in for mobile. Maybe it's around local, so that when someone walks into a store, we can identify that they're there without any hardware. So that's just a software-based system to either check someone in if they're using Facebook Places, or you can send them a coupon or a deal or something. So those are a couple of examples. I mean, if you can see kind of where we're innovating as a company, those are probably the areas where we're likely to acquire because we're hungry for new ideas and leadership. Was that the end of the question? I think so.
Pretty much. Any prognostication on other acquirers that will pick up? There's a lot of large tech companies sitting on a lot of cash. Is anyone else going to get particularly acquisitive this year?
You know, we're on a mission, and we're just so focused on what we're doing, and we have so many ideas and so much yet to do that's all we're thinking about. We're like, oh my gosh, you know, we've got, there's a saying in the company, we're kind of 1% finished, and I really believe that because there's so much of the Facebook story which is still to be written, right? Our business model isn't totally clear. What verticals we're going to go into, if any, isn't clear. What our platform becomes isn't clear. So it's just a really wacky and fascinating place to be because there's so much that we don't know yet. And so we're just focused on that and, you know, wish all the other companies all the best.
Well, as a public company, I think I'll leave the prognosticating on the number of deals to Tim and Carol. But, you know, short answer is, look, we're going to do as many make sense that we can get done. And there's no quota, up or down or whatever. I mean, we're trying to find things that will help our business leaders grow the business faster and do things that are new and interesting that we couldn't do on our own. And so we want to do as many of those as we can possibly get done that put us in a better spot in 2012 than we are here leading into 2011. in terms of where we're focused, I mean, it's, I've said we've continued to focus on what Carol ended up calling the 4 O's, and we all kind of went like that, and it's mobile, local, social, and video. Look, that's basically, I think, the major horizontal themes that the internet's dealing with, and Yahoo as sort of a big cross-section of the internet is absolutely dealing with that. We continue to see a bunch of innovation in ad tech, and we believe that we have sort of a lead and an advantage there, and we want to make sure that we continue to move as fast as the industry's going. So that's another area where I think we'll see that. Something that came out of the Dapper deal that we just did a few months ago. Those guys started out on a content play and ended up morphing into being able to ingest content from websites and target ads in a dynamic fashion. And I think that's interesting and unique, because when we sort of stepped back and looked at it, we realized that in many ways the ad part of the world has gotten more personalized than the content and experiences part of the world. And I think things that Facebook are doing and others are fascinating in terms of curating content. Twitter's doing it as well with your social network. And I think clearly in the future, just like ads are targeted algorithmically and based on what we know about you, I think that's another interesting area that that we're watching. And how do you make the web more personally relevant to you?
Eli, do you have any commentary on this
I
question?
actually have no idea how many companies Twitter is going to buy. I'm not involved with that area at all. So I think 2 companies, to answer the other part of the question, 2 companies that I personally am guessing will become very acquisitive next year are Salesforce. And I think there's a fundamental shift in their strategy, and I think they're going to buy a whole bunch of stuff. And then I actually think there's a whole wave of innovation in e-commerce. And so my prediction would be Amazon and potentially Gilt, and I think Groupon will continue to sort of plow through companies.
You think, I think Naval referenced it in his talk about medium-sized companies, still private, raising enough money to start making acquisitions. So we're going to see a lot of smaller than Facebook private companies buying even smaller companies like we have in the room here.
I've already seen that start to happen in terms of certain companies that normally wouldn't associate with M&A starting to make offers, and some of them you would think are reasonably young companies, but they're already going at it. So
Yeah, good.
I have to echo what
Sure,
was said,
sure.
and I would also add that it just doesn't necessarily work that way, where we set out to do X number of deals. They're very opportunistic based on if it falls into those various reasons why we do deals. But given that we're probably the king of the wacky companies, sorry to dethrone you, Mike. We have crazy cars that drive around that you've seen or heard about, and then we're in mobile, social, and email, and communications, and search. And personally, I can't speak for Google. I mean, I don't necessarily always find the information I need on Google.com. So I think even search is in the 2nd or 3rd inning. Advertising is still evolving, mobile's evolving, cloud computing, and we tend to be in all these areas, including robotics and green tech and all kinds of other things. So I think we're going to be busy, as our CEOs implied.